Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Wheeler Centre. My name is Benjamin Law. I'd like to begin tonight by respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. Our guest tonight is, simply put, one of the most talented fiction writers of her generation. Her first novel, After the Fire, A Still Small Voice, was shortlisted for the Orange Award for New Writers and the International IMPAC Dublin Literary Award. It won the John Llewellyn Rhys Prize and a Betty Trusk Award, and saw her listed as one of the Culture Show's Best New British Novelists and in Granta's list of Best of Young British Novelists under the age of 40, although her dual citizenship means we're still able to legitimately claim her as one of ours. Her work has earned her comparisons to Ian McEwan, Ian Banks, Peter Carey, Alan Warner and Tim Winton, with one newspaper describing her as a cross between Nicola Barker and Christos Tsiolkas. Her second novel, released just last year, is the sublime and in some ways shocking All the Birds Singing, described as an intense account of a young woman seemingly determined to disappear from the world's radar. The Observer also noted of the author, All the Birds Singing should enhance her reputation as one of our most gifted novelists. And The Spectator added, Evie Wyld's two books are quite as good as Ian McEwan's early fiction. Expect to hear her name often from now on. Only several months into the publication of All the Birds Singing, it has already been longlisted for Australia's own all-female literary award, the Stella Prize. So please welcome to the Wheeler Centre and back to Australia, Evie Wyld. Now, to begin with, Evie, you have written two books.
It's true.
Now, there are some people here who have read them and some people who haven't. So just really briefly, can we start with this book? And can you give us a bit of a précis as to what it's about? It's about two men. Who are they and how did you come to write about them?
It's about Frank and Leon, and it runs, it's got two narratives. Frank has just come to a shack by the sea. He's sort of escaping or running away from a relationship that's gone bad. There may be some violence there, and he's drinking too much, and he's basically gone there to think, I'm either going to sort myself out or drink myself to death, one or the other. And then we go back to sort of 1950s Parramatta, just outside of Sydney, and a cake shop where Leon is a young boy and he's starting to take over from his father running the cake shop, and his father goes off, signs up to fight in Korea and becomes a prisoner of war, comes back and is a very changed person, and then ends up sort of running away from home in a way, and Leon's mother follows him, so Leon's left behind. Leon then is conscripted and fights in Vietnam, and it's kind of about the trickle-down effects of war on different generations.
It's a big book, complex characters, complex themes, and complex structure as well. Did it take you a long time to write?
About 3.5 years, that one. I didn't have a publishing deal until it was finished, so I kind of could take as long as I wanted. Not that the second one was any faster, but it's sort of, it was a nice thing to be able to feel like there was absolutely, well, to feel that no one would read it, so it didn't matter how long it took.
And then All the Birds Singing was the follow-up, and the first book is very much about men and male protagonists. This time we've got a female protagonist. Again, can you give us a bit of a précis about what this book is about?
So there's Jake White, who is living alone again on a small sheep farm with her dog, who's called Dog. And
did you struggle to find a name for Dog before you settled on that one?
Well, actually, when I started, I had this image of does everybody know Foot Rot Flats? There's Wool and Dog, and it just, I kind of like the idea of this big lady and her little sheepdog. So she's living with her sort of small holding of sheep on an unnamed island in the UK, and at night something's coming and killing her sheep, and it's sort of about whether it's a person doing it or a sort of beast in the woods. And then we go back to her being a shearer in Australia, and the Australian narrative runs backwards, so it it goes back to her childhood and something dark back there.
I'm fascinated about a few things about the book. I mean, the mystery we can talk about later, the structure as well. But for me, Jake's backstory, as it's revealed, is so fascinating. And I'm wondering, when you started writing this book, what's the first germ or the seed? Is it the character? Is it the situation? Is it her backstory, which we then find out about later? Where did you start with this book?
I feel like I started in about 5 different places, but I think the kind of most overarching thing was the murder in New Zealand of the mother by her daughter and her daughter's friend, that was then made into Heavenly Creatures.
The Peter Jackson film.
Yeah. So I was looking at what those ladies are doing now, and they were too young to be prosecuted, so they were told never to see each other again and basically piss off. And they both moved to the UK separately, and one of them moved up into I think a little island near Colonsay, and rears cattle, I think, and found a god in a strong way, and the other one became a novelist, changed her name, but it says on her Wikipedia entry, so and so is also a convicted murderer. Wow. And so, nice selling point there. Yeah. And so I was just really fascinated about, they both found God, and I was really fascinated in that they were really young, and all sorts of mad stuff happens when you're that age. But I was interested in the ways that they both took this guilt and what they did with it, and also what you do as a person who doesn't believe in God. If you do something bad and it's just you left to forgive yourself, you can't rebirth yourself.
I was about to wonder whether you were going to add a punchline there and saying, and that writer is Evie Wyld, but we didn't go there, which calms me. Jake has this really quite dark backstory, and as you say, the structure's really interesting in that the flashbacks are told sequentially but in reverse order. So how do you actually go about writing a book like that? Do you actually start off knowing the full story first? No,
the way I wrote both books actually is with no real idea of what I'm doing at all.
So you are feeling your way around?
Yeah, absolutely. I sort of start in the middle and then sort of spider out both ways, and then sort of after I've got sort of 60,000 words, which is something this is about 75,000 words, I'll see what can be gained by playing with the structure, if anything. And with this one, it just seemed to hold so much more tension if it was sort of folded over on itself. And I'm also really interested in the effect of having 2 chapters next to each other that don't belong, and the sort of third atmosphere or space that creates, and the slight kind of disjuncture there that kind of feels open for people to put their own interpretation in.
Wow, so you really are experimenting a lot. In a way, it sounds like you've written a book. Let's see what else we can do with it now that we've got the constituent parts. Yeah,
I suppose so. I mean, it does always, though, feel like it feels like this book to me was always this shape. I can't think of it in another way, even though I wrote a lot of it without that idea. In fact, after the first book, I thought, right, the next book I'm going to write very simply, start at the beginning and then end, probably take me 6 months, no problem. And it just wouldn't let me do that. I had to mess around with it. So it's not that I get to a point and think, how can I complicate this? It's just that it needs to be
complicated.
It does.
Let's talk about what Jake's actually doing in the sort of present day version of her. She's got a lot of sheep around her.
She does.
And there is very vivid detail about how one wrangles sheep and live with sheep and all that sort of stuff. So I guess the obvious question is, did you grow up with sheep? How do you research this stuff? Because the details are very precise about how it works. What do you do? Do you realise she's got sheep and then go back to find out the specifics?
I'd written Jake as a character, and I'd sort of imagined her weight and size, and that she was strong and tall, and she was in these places. And there's a really boring part of writing, which is like when a character exists, they have to financially exist. And so I was sort of trying her out with all of these various different jobs. And
you were like, handing her out. Like, would she work as a waitress? Would she work as...
she wouldn't.
And it just didn't work.
It didn't work at all. And then it just became really obvious, as these things always do after, a year of worrying about it, that she would be surrounded by sheep. I've got no real interest. I've got nothing against sheep. But I've got no affinity with the sheep. And so I didn't know anything about them at all. I went and stayed on a sort of sheep estate near Hereford, and kind of went and talked to sheep farmers, and I stayed there for about a week, and just trying to get the really boring basic details out of them, like things like what time do you have to set your alarm, what do you feed them, and that was the hardest bit, actually, because they didn't want to answer those. That was their daily life, and to them it was like, well, everyone knows how to do, but look at this lamb being born. And I was less interested in the lambs being born than what do you have for breakfast.
Sure. And I mean, there's one part of the book that really describes all the rhythms of sheep farming and dealing with sheep, but there are other things as well, like the feeling that you get when a sheep is slaughtered, or your reaction. I mean, are you talking to particularly articulate sheep farmers about what they feel, or how do you get that sort of, I mean, the look in a sheep's eyes when something happens, that sort of stuff? I
think that's animals generally. I think that massive feeling of guilt that animals can produce in a person, that you can't explain that they need this, it's for their own good, or you're putting them out of their misery, or any of that sort of stuff. You can't explain it to them. I've grown up with dogs, so there's a lot of pretend communication that happens there. I talk to them a lot, and depending on what their ears do, they talk back. And you do get kind of quite convinced that you're having a conversation. And I don't know, I spent a fortnight in a small caravan on the Isle of Wight, which is the island in the book is unnamed, but it's basically a much more intense and smaller version of the Isle of Wight. I spent a fortnight in this caravan with 2 dogs in the woods, and they communicated quite a lot to me about their disgust.
How dare you do this to us?
Yeah. So it was an English summer, which meant hurricanes and hail and that sort of thing. And I thought, well, it's not a problem. I'm not actually here on my own. I've got these 2 dogs. No one's going to mess with me, and I'm going to feel completely secure. And actually, what happened was 2 a.m. they would stand up in their beds with their hackles up, stare at the door, and then start shaking and get into bed with me. And so,
great guard dogs.
Yeah, animals communicate stuff pretty well, I think. And I'm interested in, if you're not communicating with anyone else, then that's what you focus on.
I feel there are these secondary characters that aren't actually people in this book especially. I mean, there are the animals, but there's also the landscapes in which this character Jake finds herself. There's the British-English island landscape of this unknown island where she's found herself, and there's also the Australian landscape that is quite harsh. I mean, they're both harsh landscapes in particular ways. You actually grew up splitting your time between these 2 places, so would you say that your relationship to these geographies really influence your writing?
I think so. I mean, my father was very, very British, and my mother very, very Australian. So
what does that make you?
Exactly, a mess. They didn't, even though my mother still lives in London, and she loves London, but she has a lot of homesickness for Australia. She moved over there when she was 21 and wasn't supposed to stay. But they didn't really ever get on in each other's countries. And I think for me, that's a kind of just a massive point of interest. Like the English landscape, the countryside, has got this amazing historical melancholy, whereas Australia can feel much more kind of recently wounded or something. There's just, and I'm not saying that I think both landscapes are just, settings for horror movies. I think they're beautiful, and there's gentle, incredible things in both, but
also something sinister there.
Yeah, I think so. And real feelings that, like, my father would look out at the sugarcane that my family grow, and we'd be on this little house, and he'd look out over the veranda and look very troubled, and just say he found the sugarcane so depressing, and it used to upset him because he would imagine, all of the redwood and hardwood that was there before. And to me, it was the landscape of my childhood, so I found it incredible. And I would find sadness in the UK and the kind of rolling hills, and you kind of think of the history of the poetry and the kind of cold grimness of winter and February in the UK, and
I mean, there's one thing about the weather and the landscape affecting us. I guess the other thing is what we do to each other as well, which is explored quite vividly in your books. I read in an interview that you once said, "Something occurs to me and I think, that's awful, let's write it down." Have you always been particularly attracted? I mean, for instance, it sounds like the germ of this book was that really notorious case in New Zealand. Is there, even as a child, have you always been quite fascinated or triggered off by quite macabre things?
Yeah, I mean, when I was about 6, I was given a book on shark attack for Christmas, which is nice. And,
that's a great gift. Wait a minute, who gave you this? Who gave you this book?
Obviously the Australian relatives, so kind of like, let's scare them off.
Never come back.
And I think that really sparked something. I've got a graphic novel coming out next year called Rodney Fox, I Love You, and Rodney Fox is a famous shark attack survivor who you'll all be familiar with, I'm sure. He's doing a lot of work with the culling situation in West Australia at the minute, and there's this photograph of him. He's the guy who you see in all pictures with a chunk taken out of him, and he lived through it, and then there's stitches. And as a 6-year-old, I saw that and was just like, he is hot. He's amazing. And he survived that. And I had this huge crush on him. Yeah. And just, obsessed over him and obsessed over sharks. And had like a lot of English schoolgirls, a shark phobia. Yeah. Which gradually turned into an interest and now a real kind of respect and love for sharks. And so, yeah, I think people who've been through something that is so incredible like that, it's just amazing.
I mean, there's something about that. I mean, when you're describing someone who's physically disfigured, and especially in this last book, in your first book as well, people are disfigured in their own ways. I mean, psychologically, obviously, but in this book, we do learn that Jake has quite horrific scars, and as much as the initial mystery we think is about what's happening to a sheep, there are these other underlying mysteries of what's actually happened to her as well, that she bears this on her body. I think it's really interesting how you explore how people can be quite evil to each other. You have you have these unfolding sections in your book about Jake's relationship with someone named Otto. Can you sort of, without giving too much away, because that in itself is sort of an amazing reveal too, can you tell us a bit about that relationship and maybe read a bit about it as well?
Sure. So there's a point at which Jake, when she's in her teens, is living in Port Hedland, and she's selling herself for sex, and one of her regular customers is this older guy called Otto, and he's someone that she really looks forward to seeing because he's kind and doesn't get her to do anything too bizarre, and he makes this proposition. He's like, come and live on my sheep farm. I'm really lonely, I need someone to cook and clean for me. And there's a suggestion there might be some sex involved, but it seems safer and like an escape from the way she's living. And so she goes along, and inevitably things are a bit darker than, one would have liked. So this is a section from an attempt she makes to leave, and she's kind of become the farm is in the station is kind of in the middle of nowhere, and so she's kind of become a prisoner, even though the most she's locked up is at night in her bedroom. And Otto has a dog called Kelly, and I think that's all you need to know. Otto is watching his soaps with his sun-browned and knotted hands resting snugly on top of his groin. He's told me before that the heat those parts make is good for his arthritis. In the time I've been here, he's grown so used to me that on hot days like this, he doesn't bother to put his shorts on. I pretend to go out to the dunny, but instead, once I've made sure Kelly is not watching from her bed on the veranda, I nip into the tractor shed and peer into the open bonnet of Otto's spare truck, the truck that was supposed to be mine, which I know works because I've heard the engine. It's greased all over, and I have to be careful not to get any of it on me. I use a creosote-stained rag, and I reach in and yank at the wires towards the back of the engine. I don't know what I'm doing, and those could just be the wires that make the windscreen wipers go. And so I also take the monkey wrench that's resting on the edge of the bonnet, and I take out 3 important-looking washers, cringing at every squeak they make. But I can hear the television spewing out at the house, and so really it's just Kelly I have to worry about. I think about taking the keys out of the ignition too, but I imagine Otto passing by and seeing them gone. At least with the engine, he might not see it straight away. There is nothing I can find that is sharp enough to pierce the tyres, so I have to leave it at that. When I come out of the shed, I turn away from the house and throw the washers one by one, as far as I can, into the tall dry grasses of the paddock, where they can sink into the rest of the rusted scythes, the broken cages and the bicycle tyres. I can smell the carcasses of the sheep we killed last week, and I keep my gaze above the line of the grass, because yesterday I caught sight of the ewe with the black spotted nose, while Kelly was moving her body around the place, deeper and deeper into the paddock. I rub my hands in the dirt to get rid of any trace of oil, and then I count my steps back to the house, and it's my countdown. There's nothing to be done now. My hands have made the decision for me. I'll need to be gone by the next time Otto starts work on his truck. Please God, not today. I pass Kelly out on the veranda on her rag rug, and she lifts her head to smell me as I go by. It's not a smell of hello, it's a smell of what are you up to? Back inside, Otto looks up from Shortland Street and gives me a smile. He's always happiest at this time of day, with a full belly and a beer in his hand. The show on the TV, which I have to pretend to enjoy. A woman dressed as a nurse orders a lime and soda in a pub, and my hands clench. I will go in the morning. That is when his old bones are slowest. My night is sleepless, and I listen to Kelly snoring outside my window. She cries in her sleep. When the sky starts to lighten, I hear her get up and go and pee a little way from her sleeping ditch, and then I hear her slump herself back down for the final rest before the day. If she's awake, she watches the blue come into the sky, and a single bush curlew from another place, cutting across the open spaces of the paddock. The flies start to thicken the air. By the time Otto unlocks my door, I have filled my pockets with everything I can carry without looking suspicious. Before I leave the room, I look at all of the things that need to stay behind and say goodbye to them. I slide the knife from under my bed into the very back of the cupboard where it might never be found. Even after everything, I wouldn't want Otto to know I'd ever thought about slitting his throat. I cook a breakfast of chops and eggs, and he wipes a slice of white bread around his plate and sighs happily. I force down an egg on the heel of bread to look normal, but it starts to come back up, and I have to run out to the loo, and Otto rubs my back when I come out. Remember last week? Maybe it's the morning 6, he says, hopefully. When my mother was preggo with my little brother, we had to give her meadow sweet just to keep water down. I'll pick some up when I'm next in town. Not when we're next in town. That time has long passed. I wonder how long it would take for him to get me pregnant. Every time we finish, I squat in the shower and try to flush everything out. Right, he says, slapping the meat of his gut, to the day's business. He scrapes back his chair and lays a large dry hand on my shoulder as he passes by. The last time, I think, and it sends a jolt through my belly, and when he thumps down the steps to the veranda and heads out towards the dunny, throwing Kelly his chop bone as he goes, I feel a prickling on my skin. The key for the ute hangs over the oven and it catches the light. I take the can of money from under the sink and the key from its hook, and I walk as calmly as I can out of the door. Kelly is chomping her bones, standing with her legs far apart, and she looks up at me from hooded eyes as I pass, considering. I tell myself I'm fetching something from the truck, so that if she can read my mind she won't know. But the second I slot the key into the ute's door, she drops the bone from her teeth and starts up, jumping on the spot with fury, loud, loud, loud. The dunny door opens and Otto crouches with his trousers around his ankles, a red face, his yellow legs bowed. I'm inside the ute and the door is closed and the key is in the ignition. Kelly jumps at my window. I have to keep a calmness in me so that the truck won't stall, but Otto has left it in gear, which I don't notice, and so it does. And he has pulled up his trousers and the panic is setting in on me. I'm already trying to think of an excuse, that I was practicing my parking, or that I thought I'd drive up to the sheep. Nothing I know that will wash. And Otto is running at me, shaking the rolled-up comic book he's been reading, like he's going to flog me on the nose with it. His face is an open hole of anger. And the truck starts again, and I jerk away from the dog, and Otto reaches me just in time to slam his whole body onto the bonnet, and we look at each other in the eye for the count of one. And I know that somehow this will be it, that if he catches me, my body will end up in the tall, dry grasses of the paddock, with Kelly shifting me deeper and deeper in every few days, and the flies will blow me as I bloat up, and the sun peels the skin from my bones. And I'll leave it there.
It's a particularly skin-crawling section of a
Thank you.
largely skin-crawling book as well, and that is meant as a compliment, by the way. But when you write something like that, I mean, what I find fascinating about a character like Otto, because you're going to reveal more about him in backwards time as we keep reading the book, and he seems to go from utter villain to pathetic to something else. Do you, I mean, it sounds like you wrote it linearly to begin with, but as you're writing it, do the characters actually jump out and sort of surprise you as what their trajectories are? Definitely.
And I think with Otto, I actually, I think I wrote that scene fairly early on. I think the main thing that I try and do is that if I've got a character who seems too good or too bad, I try and find the other side of them. But definitely, I mean, the whole of writing books for me is about following the characters, and they always surprise me. They always kind of go down. And it sounds really kind of magical, but it's. I think you can kind of, when you get really into the world of a book, you kind of switch into a different part of your brain. And it's maybe the part that has something to do with dreaming or just that relaxed part that kind of has very little to do with your control over it.
There's one writer who described all writers as either architects or gardeners, and architects are the ones who blueprint everything so that they know what's coming up and they fill in all the gaps. But it sounds like you're more of the gardener, where you sow a seed and you're not quite sure whether it's going to be basil, tomato, or this thicket of thorns that's going to come out and bite you. It really does actually catch you off guard sometimes.
I think it really does. I knew that I wanted to write a frightening book, but I didn't know it was going to be so sort of, a friend of mine described it as stinky.
At what point do you actually know what the next book is that you're going to write? It sounds like you've written a graphic novel now. Like, was that something that you intended, or that just came up similarly as a seed and you chased it? That
was a sort of long term. I've been writing that with an illustrator for about 5 years. So that was much more structured. I've never done anything like that before, so I kind of had the story, and then we have meetings, and the story changes all the time. but with novels, it's I don't really. I might have a character in my head or maybe a place, but that's what I start with, and then I very much do my thinking on the page as I'm writing.
And it's not frustrating not having a roadmap?
No, I find I've studied creative writing, and which I don't say that because that makes me an expert, but one of the teachers I had suggested that you write 1 to 32 in the margin, and then with a sentence about what happens, and that just seemed like the death of writing for me. It was just like, why would you, if you've come up with this dry little story, why would you then write it? If you kind of, I like it best when I'm writing and it feels like reading. It's like I don't know what's going to happen, and anything could.
I mean, you mentioned that you did study creative writing. There is that question, and I don't want to dwell on it too much, but the idea of whether writing can be taught, and it sounds like from that situation, it's like you might want to question the prospect whether writing can be taught. What's your feeling towards it?
My feeling, I mean, it's not for everyone. For me, I found it really helpful. I did an MA that was basically an eclectic reading list, a year to take myself seriously as a writer, and I just studied short stories. That's all I wrote. I didn't attempt to do a novel. I really question the courses that guarantee that by the end of this course you will have written a novel, because it implies a publishable novel. And then other than that, it was basically going to stuff like this and listening to other authors speak and having a few one-to-one sessions with a published author. And it's not, this is how you write a sentence, this is what you should do with structure.
There are some really sublime short story writers who insist they'll never write a novel, that this is the form in which they write, and that's to be respected. What about for you? Like, for novel writers or people who aspire to be, do you need to be a writer of short stories first to build that muscle initially before you take off and run the marathon? I think
they're so different. I mean, John McGregor sort of talks about how for him short stories take a lot longer to write than novels. For me, I had no intention at all to write a novel until, and this is going to sound really not at all magical, until somebody asked me to. An agent got in touch after reading a short story and said, would you write a novel, because short stories don't sell. And I just thought it'd be nice to have an agent. So yes, right. I lied. And then she got in touch and was like, where's this novel then? And so I gave it a go. For me, I think... And
it was your first attempt?
First attempt, yeah.
Pretty good attempt. Did well.
For me, I think it helped me personally, paying attention to short stories first, because it's about every word mattering and every silence mattering.
It's disciplined.
And I feel, even though novel writing is so vastly different, it does feel like the attention to language is still there.
Now, you wear several hats in your day-to-day life. You are a novelist and a writer. You also run a bookshop.
I do.
And you also assess manuscripts. And even though all of these things sound like they're within the same world, they're very different gears. And I'm wondering whether either of those two other roles actually help you with this role and this task at hand, or whether it influences you.
I get asked quite a lot what... I think there's this idea that if you work in a bookshop, you somehow absorb all the closed
by
books
osmosis.
And I would say that maybe my book selling is perhaps influenced by being a writer, but not the other way around.
How so? What do you mean?
Well, like, if you rear the sheep and then slaughter the sheep, you're going to do it a little bit more sympathetically, I think, and then you're not going to kind of laminate the meat afterwards. You're going to treat it with respect. So, I mean, and so I know a lot of people in publishing, and I know how hard they work, and I kind of know what's out there. So there's something in that. But the other way around, I don't think... it's when I'm in the bookshop, I am worrying about the bookshop going under and worrying about selling books, and that is where it stops. I'm not kind of thinking, I'm going to write a novel about a woman working in a bookshop. It just isn't. And the assessing manuscripts, I do that very rarely now. I used to. It was a lifeline when, with the first book, when I was desperate for money to pay rent and stuff. But I find it so time consuming because you really feel for these people who are struggling, and it's so much easier to see mistakes in other people's manuscripts. It doesn't. You can kind of look at it and think, I'd never do that, and then you make exactly the same mistake in your next.
I was going to ask you, I mean, you would assume maybe that it would help you be a better writer, so you see other people's mistakes, does it?
I think it can. So my husband's a literary agent, and we met on a creative writing course, so he's a very good writer, but seeing bad work or seeing first drafts where people make mistakes and he can immediately pick it up has stopped him writing. And I think it can do that because you have to get a certain amount of crap. I mean, so much, these are quite small books and they've all been about that thick at some point with the most turgid crap. And you have to just get over that and get over the fact that you can write badly even if you're a good writer. So
can I ask a really boring question before we move on? I mean, running a bookshop is hard, and I've worked in a bookshop and I've seen how hard my boss worked, and it's a full-time job. So where do you actually find time to write? Can you sort of lead us through
question. It's something I'm trying to work out.
Yeah, are you?
So I think what I've done before, I've just started a third novel, and I'm just trying to kind of get back into a routine. I work best in the mornings, so...
How early are we talking about? As early as sheep farmers?
Not as oh God, no. Yeah. But maybe it depends on the season. It's really hard in London to make yourself get up at 6, and because you feel like you've come home after a day's work and you've still got a good 4 hours of darkness.
Yeah.
So my bookshop opens at 10, and I try and work at least from 7 when I'm writing.
Right.
So 7 till 9:30, and then get to the shop, which is not very long. But as long as it's kind of like filling a page, something comes out of it.
But really, I mean, at the end of the day, you've worked an entire day's work plus quite extra. This is work.
It's great, isn't it? Yeah. It is. It's really tough at the moment. I'm struggling a bit, but I do have. You talked about wearing different hats as an author. I have a milliner who works for me.
Oh, okay. And actually makes you a writing hat?
Well, she has, yeah.
We were always told to put our thinking caps on. You've literally got one.
Yeah. It's more of a thinking fascinator.
Yeah.
But she does weekends for me. So,
right. Otherwise it's just you?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I'm quite tired. But yeah, while I'm away, I've been away travelling quite a lot, and so we'll either close for like a couple of days a week and then she'll pick up the slack.
Right.
But then it's sort of about, the balance of keeping a bookshop open is how much I'm spending on staff and how much, At the moment we're very happily and solidly open, but it's a difficult climate.
Want to give you a bookshop a quick spruik for anyone visiting London? Is it London?
It's Peckham, which is southeast London, and it's called Review, and we'd love to see you there.
And you do run events sometimes as well?
We do, yeah. We try and run an event sort of once every month, and then in November we have the Peckham Literary Festival, which is very, very small. It's just me opening up my basement and letting some writers in, but
that's great.
Yeah, it's good.
I love that. You did mention your third book, and I'm always loath to ask the question about what's next because it can feel sometimes violating. But what can you tell us about your next book, and do you feel like you've consciously chosen the subject matter, or it seems to have? I mean, slightly magical process. Has it sort of come to you? It's
this one's a little bit different from the way that I've worked before. For a start, it's set in England. I think entirely, and it's in the past. It's sort of to do with the English side of my family, my grandparents. So my grandfather's first wife died of tuberculosis, and they'd had 2 kids. He came back from war and she died, and she was this vivacious, amazing woman by all accounts. and he came back to these two traumatised little boys, and within 6 months married my grandmother. And when I knew my grandmother and my grandfather, it was this, I don't know, I couldn't quite say loveless marriage, but it was, my grandmother had been an alcoholic for decades, and she was extremely English, so English, it was incredible. She's sort of chain smoking, and she says things like ghastly, and she's about 9 foot tall and steely grey, and
she sounds like a cracker.
She was good. She was a good value lady. But so she was also the daughter of the Dean of Windsor, which meant, the daughter of a bishop, English, and she was the last person in our family to have any religious faith. But what her faith was that so my grandfather died about 15 years ago. My grandmother died last year, and in her 90s, and she'd been trying to die for decades. She'd been really going for it and not quite getting there. And and she the thing she used to talk about was like, I'm going to get to heaven. She was quite clear that was where she was going. And John, her husband, would have already met up with his first wife, Helen, who had died when she was beautiful in 21. Oh. And she's like, and I'm going to show up, and look at me, I'm old. And so I'd sort of had this quite specific idea of their relationship, which was not a great love story. And then after she died, I found their honeymoon photographs, which showed them like being these totally different people. My grandmother laying on a bed. I'd never seen, she was always perfectly presented in her chair, laying on a bed in a bit of negligee, looking really beautiful and really rude, like she looked so sexy. And then a picture of my grandfather doing a Buster Keaton impression. And, he was always this sort of fairly humourless old man. And it just made me think there's a totally different life from, and so I want to write a fictional memoir, I suppose, of her, really.
We'll take questions soon. So as you guys think about it, there will be ushers coming up with microphones. So put up your hand if and when you're ready. But before we move on to the audience, it really does sound like as time goes on and you find out more about your family, there are these rich reservoirs of information to tap into. Your first book, for instance, also slightly inspired by family history. Can you tell us a bit about that before we move on to these guys?
So my uncle, Tim, who I'm going to go and stay with after Melbourne, was conscripted and fought in Vietnam. And so it's sort of... and also my mother grew up in a pie shop in Parramatta, so there's all sorts of links there. But so I kind of used the relationship with time. I don't think it's giving anything away too much that Leon and Frank are father and son. And then there's also this other character who's Leon's father. So it was kind of based on my grandfather, my uncle, and my cousin, who had this manly Australian relationship. They're farm people, and they're sort of inside kind and funny and very sweet. But because they were all men, they couldn't... I've never seen any of them hug each other or anything like that. And the way that my uncle would communicate his love for my cousin when he was a little kid was to give him a dead arm, just like really hit him quite hard on the arm and then go, "It's only pain." And it was,
it's very manly.
So I was interested in that kind of, that the people in my first book are all estranged, but my family are very much not.
Okay, and with that in mind, maybe we can take some questions from the audience. If you just raise your hand, we'll pass the mic over to you. Oh, you're going to be one of those crowds, aren't you? No, we've got a question right up at the front here. You can kick things off, dear sir.
Hello there.
Hello, love.
You said that the book was written in all different directions and was this big and then this big. What was the point that was the most... What was the most challenging aspect?
Well, there were two things. There was one that was once it was almost there, and I had this funny structure. It became a bit like a maths problem. So having to work out in the sort of climactic scenes in Australia, like how much I could have happen, and how much I had to, there was a lot of stuff about Jake's family, and about her brothers. She's got triplet brothers, and I wrote a lot more about that, which I really enjoyed, and I really loved being in that world, that I just had to cut because it didn't work anymore within the framework of the novel. So that was really hard. But then I also had 6 months when I had to leave it because my father wasn't well, and it was really hard coming back to it after that, after he died, because it felt very much like I was terrified about writing half of a book, before and half after, and it being like visible. So that was really hard. I think it takes, for me, when I leave a book for too long, it takes such a lot to get back into it. I think that was probably the trickiest bit.
Can I ask a follow-on question to that? It's a great question, and also about the structure as well, because we touched upon how you have this linear story, then you rearrange it. Can I ask how you actually start doing that? Like, some writers use tools like a program called Scrivener where you can mess things around. Other writers I've seen actually use Microsoft Excel, and other writers I've seen chop things up physically and lay it on the floor, like some sort of murder detective. What do you actually do to figure out how this is going? Because it feels quite meticulous. Like when you read it, it feels seamless. But I imagine as a writer, it would take a lot of effort.
It's horrible. I'm quite a big fan of cutting stuff up and making a collage. So I kind of use a bit of all of those. I make a chart. I find that with a novel, I have to make some kind of very dull chart just so that I can position myself in it. I think because I mainly work on a laptop, and you can get this really skewed idea that your novel is in fact the size of a laptop screen.
And just a scroll.
Yeah, and you can't imagine what's up here and what's down there. So I have to kind of, at some point, just sort of write what the hell happens. Because also when you're writing a novel, you also have all of the things that you've thought about it, that you've written down in your notebook, that you've deleted. They're all still in your head, and you can't, or I can't, my brain's not good enough, you can't kind of update your memory of what happens in the novel at this stage. It's just, so there are whole chunks in here that I believe are still in there and I know I've taken out, but the stuff about the triplets, there was the first Australian chapter was originally at one of the triplets' funerals, and that doesn't happen at all now, But so that's quite weird. I'm also a big fan of if I get stuck on a particular thing, I will literally do like a sort of teenage art project collage. With the first book, I did a Billy Graham collage. And I think, it's totally useless, obviously, but there's something about spending, rather than going and doing something completely different, there's something about spending an hour and a half cutting out pictures of Billy Graham and arranging them. That means you're sort of meditating on it, even though you're not directly.
I love this idea of it. Do you sell these collages at your bookshop afterwards? Signed?
I'm really gutted I didn't keep it, actually.
Another question from the floor, perhaps. There's one back there.
Thanks. Actually, I suppose I could throw two at you, but the first one follows on from that. In your rearranging of stories, you said you're working on a graphic novel, and I do both. I write and I draw. But when you're changing stories around, does that drive your illustrator bananas because they've just sketched out 6 pages intricately and you go back and change the story around? Yeah,
it really does. I'm lucky in that he's a very close friend. So, or I'm unlucky, I don't know. He's, it's sort of, we started to do it because he is a fantastic illustrator and he wanted to do something. And I said, well, look, I've got this thing that I was thinking about and let's try and do it together. So it started out with a short story and then us just deleting stuff and working out what would fit as an image and what we could lose. And I did say to him at the beginning the way I work is I write a lot of stuff, then I delete a lot of stuff. So, yeah, we've thrown away a lot of beautiful drawings. It's been really tragic, but I think he gets that it's for the good of the story. And I think after the initial hump, I think we kind of, I think we're both invested quite deeply in it. So I think it's now he's kind of quite up for it. Thank God.
Just a separate issue. As both a bookshop owner and a writer, do you have a particular opinion on ebooks?
I think there's a place for all sorts of books. I think there's even a place for Amazon, in that there are places in other countries where they can't get books unless it's through Amazon, and so it's great that they can get books. I have no understanding of why anyone in Peckham is using Amazon though. You know, I think ebooks have their place. They are, you know, especially people who work in publishing, they don't have to lug around all of these massive texts all the time. I personally don't read from them. I can't get the hang of it. But I think with the sort of the downloading of literature, I just think if you love it, it's fine to download it, but then if you love it, buy it in hardback, and then people can still write, and then publishers can still publish books, and bookshops can still sell books. So that's kind of, I think it's about a balanced diet, really.
Why don't we take another question while we're searching? Anyone with a question there? Yep.
Hi. You mentioned before about how Leon is Frank's father, which was something I eventually picked up while reading the book. And I was wondering how much you trust your readers to make these connections, to fill in the gaps, because there are quite a lot of things that you have to infer throughout the books rather than are given to you.
Sure. I think it's more, I trust that it doesn't matter if they don't pick it up. My father-in-law realised on the very last page that they were father and son. And he still enjoyed the book, you know, it's still a story. And it really doesn't matter to me too much, as long as it doesn't kind of spoil your reading of it. There are different hints the whole way through. There's actually in the second chapter, you know, they've all got the same second name, and I just sort of thought people might work it out and they might not, and that's okay. That's kind of what life is like a little bit. And I really like having echoes that can be picked up or not picked up. So I like reading books that aren't straightforward and that aren't all laid out simply for people. So I suppose that's what I'm doing. I'm writing the kind of book that I enjoy reading. But yeah, I know that it is frustrating sometimes for people that they're kind of like, you know, but I want to be told these things. But I think that's maybe a different book, and many different brilliant books that work.
It's a mystery on top of a mystery in a way, isn't it? So there's the mystery of the narrative, but you have to solve how these people are connected or what happened to them.
Yeah, it's basically a choose your own adventure.
Yeah, it's fun. Fun and grim. We've got probably time for two more questions if there are any more. Yep, one here as well later on.
Hi. Really enjoyed the conversation that you've had tonight. I was interested, it takes you a long time to write a book. I think you mentioned your first book took 3.5 years, and then this book about Graham took 4 and 5 years. How does the relationship with yourself and the book change over time? Do you argue with it? Do you love it? Do you break up with it? I mean, what happens during that long journey?
That's a good question. I think, over 4 or 5 years, you change a lot as a person. So there's definitely, although I don't start at the beginning and write till I get to the end and then go back, it's kind of much more messy than that. There is definitely a point where I'll finish a draft and I'll start reading, you know, for editing, and I'll just think, oh my God, you know, that was that was me when I was an idiot, and now I'm a genius. But for like the first book, although I'm very proud of it, and you know I'm thrilled that I published it, and I think there's some good stuff there. It's not how I write anymore, and the whole process of writing a novel, you learn how you're doing it every time. Well, I've only done it twice, but every time so far, I've been teaching myself what the hell I'm doing. So, yeah, there's definitely moments of huge frustration and total boredom. I mentioned having to work out how people survive financially. Stuff like that just makes you want to go and jump off a bridge, because you do feel like you're applying for jobs, or you know, it's that, or just sort of getting people to a place. You have to work out how they got there, and you know, that's really annoying. So I have hated my second book so much. I think partly because I'm very bad at maths, and it did feel very much like a maths problem at parts. Partly because there's this feeling that I get, you know, before you start a book, when you're sat at a blank page, and you're kind of like, you have this amazing run-up feeling of, you know, this is going to be the one. I'm going to get down what I'm talking about here, and I'll show you all. And actually, you finish it, and you go, "Oh, no, that wasn't really what I meant." And so there's a sort of disappointment that comes every time I finish something, that it's not what I meant. But I suppose that's the spur to write the next one. I hope. Touch wood.
There's one more question up here. That just reminds me of Zadie Smith once saying that to look back on past work is to induce nausea, and it's like taking a tour of a cell in which you were once incarcerated. Yeah.
It's really horrible.
Evie, thanks for your talking tonight. We've enjoyed both of your books very much. I'm fascinated, for someone who spends most of their time in the UK, how you've got such a strong affinity with the Australian landscape. I mean, Tim Winton was mentioned as someone that you've been linked with in some ways, and I mean, I certainly see parallels in the writing, and but he lives in Australia, and the landscape is so strong in his novels, but it comes out so strongly in yours. Do you find this a very fertile ground for your writing?
I do. I mean, maybe it's sort of nostalgia in a way. I mean, I haven't lived in Australia for more than a year at a time, and most of the kind of places that I mine for images, it's mainly from when I was quite a small child. I think there's two things, and one is that childhood memories are so much more vivid and so much weirder and more interesting than our kind of adult memories. There are so many more misunderstandings and misconceptions of things like size. You know, the size I thought sharks could get to when I was 6 was incredible. And then the other thing is that I don't think I could ever write a novel set in London. I mean, you know, never say never, but I can't understand how I would get into it, because writing about a place that's in front of you, I just find that stops me from being able to follow my imagination anywhere. I find that I'm so concerned with getting on the page exactly what this is, that I don't have any space for a story. It's just this difficult sort of raking through of images. And I certainly found in the second book the much harder parts to write were the UK bits, because I was near them. So maybe that's got something to do with it. But
well, thank you so much for being a great audience. Evie will be staying behind to sign books up in the over yonder. So please purchase one if you haven't already, and please get your existing copies of your books signed. But can you please join me in thanking Evie Wyld for making the journey and coming here tonight?